Alright, ready for launch, Doom Guy. I'm sorry.
The Ancient Gods Part 1 is one of the most challenging, brutal, and relentless first-person shooter experiences I think I've had since, well, Doom Eternal. As the first in a planned 2-part release, this DLC continues the story on from the end of the base game. After the Doom Slayer defeats the Icon of Sin, spoilers, he continues working with the Seraphim and the remnants of the UAC to prevent the remaining forces of Hell from invading Earth again and yada yada yada. Yeah, look, I'm not going to go into too much depth on that side of things, but I will say that there is a good story in here, and the way that it develops the lore is just awesome. There's a really cool bunch of scenes with the Slayer and a UAC intern who's helping him carry out his missions, which is about one of the most wholesome things I've seen in gaming in recent years.
Alright, ready for launch, Doom Guy.
Then you've got some of the plot twists and that ending, which I actually had ruined for me because of one very stupid YouTuber who should have known better. But still, when I finally got to that point and finished the whole thing, I literally had goosebumps. I do keep hoping they're gonna finally do a Quake crossover and have Ranger show up in some capacity, but look, I'm still happy with where they're taking this series. They fully embraced the cheese with the story, and I'm all for that.
Okay, I'll take that as a yes.
But it's the gameplay additions here, which, despite being so small and minute when you see it on paper, just makes such a fundamental difference to how Doom Eternal plays, and that's all that really matters the most. I said a while back how I thought that Doom Eternal was an evolution for the genre, and it's a statement that I stick by. It was a game that forced us to adapt to a new playstyle. The Doom Slayer was the Swiss Army knife of FPS protagonists with a tool for each job. The Ancient Gods hasn't deviated from that at all. In fact, it's kind of knuckled down on it even more, including new mechanics which require specific strategies to overcome. If you didn't like how the base game made you march to the beat of Hugo and Marty's drum, and are one of those people who seem to think it was a worse off version of Doom 2016, well, then I'm sorry to say, but this DLC isn't going to win you over. They've even removed the Crucible entirely, so yeah, no more easy kills against those tougher demons. But then again, considering that thing's broken off inside the Icon of Sin's head, it makes sense that it's not here. Ancient Gods doesn't add in any new weapons, and it only adds in a few new enemies, most of which are just basically reskins anyway. But it's more about the way these new enemies fit in with the meta of Doom Eternal that makes such a huge change. Honestly, I think the last time a Doom game added in enemies which so profoundly affected the way you played the game was back with Doom 2. When Doom 2 added in enemies like the Revenants and the Mancubus, it totally changed how you played that game. With the Revenants, you kind of had to engage these guys at medium to close range to best avoid their missiles, and the spread on that Mancubus cannon prevented just mindless circle strafing. Now look, I'm far from being the best Doom Eternal player, and watching a lot of the content coming from people who know this game back to front has definitely taught me that, but I do like to think that I've got a pretty good grasp on the mechanics. With Doom Eternal, I found that Ultra Violence was like the normal difficulty. I'm not saying it was easy, but if you're fairly good at shooters and can get into the groove of the gameplay, it's pretty easy to get into a rhythm where everything just kind of coasts along smoothly. Nightmare was the real challenge in that game. It suddenly turned the fodder enemies into a threat, and you really had to be aware of your cooldowns and the best weapons to use against which enemies. I mean, you really should have been doing that anyway, but Nightmare emphasized it even more and almost enforced it. It was a bit cliche, and the saying got thrown around more than bad takes on Doom 3's shotgun, but it really was like a game of chess. You had to be aware of the moves your opponents could make and be planning a couple of steps ahead. Still though, it was manageable once you got the hang of it, but now that's all gone to hell with the Ancient Gods Part 1. Right, now at this point, before I get too invested talking about ripping and tearing, I have got to give a quick shout out to Simplisafe for sponsoring this video. As we're heading into the end of the year and the holidays, there's a real rise in the amount of break-ins. So that's why Simplisafe are having their biggest sale of the year. As a guy who's had his stuff stolen in the past, just let me say that there's nothing fun about having people break into your house. People into gaming like myself probably own a few consoles and other gadgets, which make for perfect targets. Simplisafe is a really cool, easy, and modern approach to home security. You order it all online or over the phone, it's delivered right to your door, free shipping as well, and best of all, it's super easy to set up. The system is totally flexible and you can adapt it for wherever you like, whether it's a house, apartment, or a business. You've got keypads, motion sensors, glass break and entry sensors, sirens, panic buttons, and of course cameras. It's also got water and fire sensors in case you leave the iron on or your graphics card overheats when you turn on ray tracing. And it's all been designed specifically to not be noticed and just blend in with your surroundings. This is all connected to a monitoring system that's also able to call the police if it's alerted to anything. It's almost kind of like building a PC in the way you pick and choose the kind of parts that you personally need. And if you don't really want to worry about choosing these parts individually, you can also just go with one of their pre-made packages. With a lot of other security products, you're looking at anywhere from a 12 to 36 month contract. But with Simplisafe, it's month to month for as little as $1 a day. So over the course of about 3 years, you can save over $1,000. That's not peanuts. It's got really great reviews on Google, TechCrunch, and Amazon, and best of all, if you're not happy with the product after 60 days, you get a full refund. They'll even pay for the shipping back. So check out Simplisafe's holiday sale by heading over to simplisafe.com/GmanLives. The Ancient Gods Part 1 feels like a giant middle finger to all of those people who broke Doom Eternal and figured out all of the best strategies and exploits, and I almost kind of picture Hugo Martin sitting there with that big wholesome grin on his face just laughing to himself, thinking about everyone getting their asses kicked by this DLC. I think at this point, and look, I'm really not trying to act elitist or anything, but if you're going to make content on Doom Eternal, or share any kind of thoughts or ideas about it, you really do have to be playing it on Nightmare difficulty. So assume that every critique I make in this video, unless I say otherwise, is based off that. I don't know, man, anything under that just feels too forgiving. Like it lets you get away with far too much. And the difference between ultra violence and the Nightmare mode in this, even compared to the base game, is just humongous. This DLC is going to test everything you've learned about Doom Eternal so far, and you're either going to triumph or perish horribly. This to me though is still I think the best that new Doom gameplay and combat has ever been. Notice that I'm separating new Doom from the old Doom. I can't think of any other shooter I've played aside from Doom Eternal obviously that just constantly requires the player to be so aware of their own abilities and skill set, but also the environment and all of the enemies within it. After finishing the first level on Nightmare, I actually had to hop off my computer and take a break for a little bit. I went outside and got some air, I called my parents, I went for a walk and patted a dog, just to reconnect myself with my physical form. What I'm trying to say is that this DLC is intense. There seems to be this weird rule among people who play this game that you're not allowed to criticize any element of the level design, like you're gonna lose your gamer cred for saying that something is bad or not all that good. Well look, I do think that despite how solid the vast majority of this thing is, there really are just flat out terribly designed areas in the DLC. Environments that have just been put together in a way which seems to just make them as crushing as possible. If for no other reason than to just stick it to that 1% of the ultra elite players who can probably at this point finish Ultra Nightmare runs in their goddamn sleep. To me, the best areas in the DLC and just Doom Eternal in general are the ones that have a flow to them. If I can map out a route around the area and deviate off it as I need to, well then to me that's good design. Standing still is suicide in Doom Eternal, and more so with the DLC, so you really need to be moving pretty much all of the time, and an arena that facilitates that with jump pads and portals is ideal. The Ancient Gods is full of those kind of arenas, and they are satisfying as fuck to play through. Sadly though, for every 4 or 5 well-designed areas in this thing, there's one that I just think flat out isn't, and lo and behold, these are the ones that are much more linear and less focused on movement. Most of my time in this DLC I thought was well spent. I had a pretty good groove going, but then I just get to these roadblock sequences and get stuck there for 15 or 20 minutes, where it kind of felt like I was banging my head on a wall over and over until it finally clicked and I could progress onward. When I finally finished these sections, I didn't feel a sense of accomplishment or pride for finally beating it. Instead, I just felt pissed off that the game had wasted my time. Difficulty spikes in levels which otherwise have a pretty good flow to them, to me, is just inconsistent design. And I just feel the challenge should be ramping up gradually instead of violating you in these short, random, sporadic bursts. That's something that Doom Eternal mastered. I mean, by the time you got to the Icon of Sin, and were taking part in some of the more intense fights at the end of the campaign, everything you'd learned up until that point was being put to the test, so you were really just going through the motions. These shorter, crushing sequences in the Ancient Gods, which come out of nowhere, just kind of feel like I'm getting sucker punched in the throat. All up in the Ancient Gods, there's 3 new missions, and they'll probably take like an hour or so each for a first time playthrough. The first level's pretty much just a warm-up. Now, I say warm-up, even though it's probably still going to take about an hour or so to get through for the first time. But as tough as it is, it's really just meant to get you back into the swing of things. Not all of us have been playing Doom Eternal daily since release, or doing in-depth videos on the meta of how each weapon works and how every demon behaves. So yeah, getting back into this thing for the first time in months was a bit of a trial by fire. What I'm trying to say is that I got my ass handed to me, right? But once I got used to how the whole thing played again, it was fine. I was in the groove and things progressed smoothly. I was swapping back and forth through weapons and shooting frost grenades at enemies with the best of them. During this first level, one of the new enemies, if you can even call them that, makes its first appearance, and that's the turrets. Now, I've long thought that turrets are about the most piss-weak enemy type you can put in a video game, and these sure haven't changed my mind. You have to hit these things twice before they finally bugger off, and when they're thrown in with the normal demons, they become a bit of a pest and a total distraction until you destroy them. More irritating than challenging, I think they're just one of the lamest additions in the DLC, and about the only saving grace is that they're not that common after the first level. But as a bit of a reintroduction to the game, this is an awesome first level for the DLC. I'm reminded again of how good this game looks and runs, and I'm still convinced that someone at id Software must have made some kind of deal with the devil to get this engine so well optimized. I really love that effect too. You get outside when it's raining and you can see the individual drops of rain on your weapons. Awesome. We need raining more in video games, and I think by law, every game should have at least one level where it's raining. There's a few platforming sections which I think are still terrible, but this is heavily downplayed compared to the base game, which is good, because the platforming I think is about as fun as trying to use your asshole to crush beer cans. Near the end of the level, you've got to take on 2 marauders at once, but I mean, I think at this point, everyone's figured out how to take these guys out with relative ease. It is a bit of a shock though when it first happens because you're probably not prepared for it, but it's not as tough as I thought it was going to be. In fact, I think the further you get into the DLC, it almost becomes a bit of a relief when you see these guys, because it's usually just the two of you going head to head. If nothing else, it makes a nice alternative to the other 90% of the DLC, where you're being attacked by a dozen demons at once. Case in point, the fight right after you beat those 2 marauders is way more challenging. The second level, named the Blood Swamps, is where they really start to ramp things up. Right off the bat, you've got these poison sack things which are scattered all over the place, spitting out toxic goo over the floor that constantly refills itself. It's like trying to walk out of your mum's bedroom at 6 AM in the morning. They throw in a nasty and kinda fun little surprise where you gotta take on a swarm of buffed demons, followed by a goddamn buffed marauder. Which, the first time I saw that, I was instantly amazed by, but also stunned at how id Software hadn't thought of that before. More importantly though, the Blood Swamps also introduces the spirits, and these things right here is what separates the boys from the men. You'll know when a spirit is around because you'll see a blue glowing demon that happens to also move much faster and be resilient to the ballista and the super shotgun, which is a bit of a big middle finger to people like myself who abuse that combo all of the time. It still didn't stop me shooting them with the ballista like an idiot though, almost I think just out of habit. Oh yeah, and on top of that, they can almost take double the amount of damage before dying, so yeah, that's fun. Once you do enough damage to a possessed demon, you then have to glory kill it before out pops the spirit. You've then got to go all Peter Venkman and kill them with the plasma rifle's microwave beam, or else they'll possess another demon and then the cycle repeats. Oh yeah, and while you're doing this, the other demons aren't twiddling their thumbs waiting for you to finish. That 5 seconds or so it takes to cook these things is gonna feel like 5 hours. This mechanic alone really messes with how most people are comfortable playing the game, which is by constantly being on the move. And I'm just still not sure whether or not I like this. I mean, the balancing for all of the demons felt pretty much perfect to me in the base game. Now they're just giving them double speed and double damage willy-nilly. It kind of throws a big fat wrench into the works. Once you start seeing these things thrown in during combat though, is where you're going to start to see some serious shit. During one bit in the second level, you've got to go through a wave featuring 2 buff totems, followed by 2 Barons of Hell, followed by 2 Tyrants, and then another 2 Barons of Hell, one of which is possessed. I mean, fuck. The choice you've always got to make is, do you go straight for the possessed demon, or take out the others first so it doesn't have a chance to repossess them? And again, the whole time I'm playing through all of this, all I can see is Hugo's smiling face. But this isn't what bothers me the most about this level. I can deal with that. The thing that grinds my gears is how much the environment relies on obfuscation as a means of challenge. And this is the first time you start to see how some of the level design can falter. There's a couple of areas where you're in thick fog to the point that you can't even see more than a few meters ahead of you. And in one instance, you're getting attacked by a possessed arachnotron. Oh yeah, I don't think I mentioned either, but a possessed enemy can't be stunned. It can't be frozen or have its weapons broken either. So what this means is that you've got an arachnotron, which are a pain in the ass at the best of times, shooting at you when you can't even see it, at twice its normal speed with twice the amount of health points, and you can't even break its turret to give you a fighting chance. That possessed arachnotron is out there. It can't be bargained with, it can't be reasoned with, it doesn't feel pity, remorse, or fear, and it absolutely will not stop until you are dead. Oh, and to make it even more fun, you've got those guys spawning in with energy shields at the same time, followed by a fucking Doom Hunter that spawns in as well, surrounded by a dozen or so of those toxic pustule thingies. I mean, it's like throwing someone into a coffin full of scorpions to fight a rabid pit bull. These are the kind of environments that just seem to me like they're hard for the sake of being hard, and it's not an enjoyable challenge to me. Not being able to see what is attacking me is where the difficulty comes from, not the enemies outmaneuvering me or outsmarting me, but just the fact that I quite literally cannot see them. A good example of this on the flip side is again when you're moving through fog later in the level. This time there's a spectral wolf that you've got to follow, and every now and then he stops and demons start spawning in from every direction. This, however, in contrast, is awesome because they throw the right kind of enemies at you for the limitations of the environment. You've got just enough time to ascertain what type of demon is attacking you and then act accordingly, but more importantly, you can actually see them. They do kind of mess that up for the last part of this section though, where you've got to take on a marauder and a turret at the same time. But this again I think just proves my point, how something as simple as the placement of a single demon can massively affect a combat sequence. I'd say that I enjoyed about 90% of the combat in this level, but that remaining 10 or so percent, man, not so much. The boss for this level is a couple of floating eyeball cube things that you've got to shoot a few times and then whack with your fist, which compared to avoiding a room of tyrants and possessed barons of hell is a bit of a cakewalk. Finally, we've got the last level in the game, the Holt. We're back in Urdak with some of the most gorgeous environments in the game yet. That also made me realise that we're basically playing games at this point that look better than pre-rendered cinematics. The Holt introduces the Bloodmakers, another enemy that kind of messes around with mobility, and like the turrets, kind of requires your undivided attention until you deal with them, because they've got a very limited window of opportunity to be killed. This level also features what I think is the most crushing sequence in the DLC, where you're on this bridge and then have to deal with two tyrants, one that happens to be possessed, along with two carcasses and a goddamn Doom Hunter. I mean, I think I died more times during this encounter than I died during the entire DLC up until that point, and it's another one of those really tough sections that just feels like it comes out of nowhere. It is gatekeeping the final boss though, so you would kind of expect it to be tough. But funnily enough, I think the final boss is actually pretty forgiving, if only for the fact that you get a checkpoint in between each of its phases. Its last phase is one of the most unforgiving things in the whole DLC, but the benefit of not having to replay it from scratch every time you die is almost uncharacteristically generous, and it just kind of made me impressed even more at the people who managed to beat this thing on Ultra Nightmare. Anyway, it all comes to an end with one of the most brutal cliffhangers we've had in the series yet, and one that left me with goosebumps the size of matzo balls. I don't want to spoil it because I'm not a gigantic prick, but it is good stuff. I think this is far from being perfect DLC, but just in terms of upping the ante, well, they've definitely achieved it, and it's pretty impressive how they've subtly managed to make the game so much more challenging, whilst not really having to change or add in all that much new stuff. Either way, once again, Hugo and Marty have made us their bitch, and from what I've heard, they're apparently planning to dial it up another notch for part 2. I don't know when it's supposed to be coming out, I just hope it's enough time for my blood pressure to return to a normal level, so I don't actually have a goddamn heart attack playing it. And just the mere thought of a buffed, possessed marauder is enough to leave me in a cold sweat.